Do you need to add people?
I think we're all good. Anybody who's got the link can log on.
And is it recording?
It is recording, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce
Emilie today for the colloquium.
Welcome to our colloquium. We have lots of guests today and a student does the presentation. This is an actual enrolled course as well as an open one. So go for it, Cammie.
So I'll be introducing Emilie today. She is a water policy specialist and Steve Grant Fellow at the Center for Water Policy here. And at the center, she conducts research on the intersection of law, policy, and science. And today we'll get a little more into that. So the research that she's working on at the center investigates the environmental footprint of data centers in the US with focus on water usage. And she'll be detailing the research using publicly available government records and corporate sustainability reports from the leading tech companies that assesses the environmental impacts of data centers. And then she's then going to identify some legislative options for subnational governments to consider, and that's informed by a 50-state review she did in the US.
And thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I'm looking forward to sharing the Center for Water Policy's research on AI data centers and their environmental impacts. Can you hear me in the back also? Good. Okay. Like Kim said, my name is Emilie Washer. I'm a recent graduate at Lewis and Clark Law School, originally from the Chicago area, so it's really good to be back here. And I'm a water policy specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for Water Policy. The center conducts academic research on water policy dilemmas and peer-reviewed articles for a variety of audiences, from academia to government decision makers and the public. The center has been researching the water demands of AI data centers for almost 2 years. We started by researching the water and energy demands of AI data centers, and then moved into a second phase of research involving a 50-state review of legislation regulating this emerging industry. So the research I'm sharing today is the result of the hard work of key collaborators on these different phases of research. I would like to acknowledge the team and thank specifically Peyton McCauley, Dan McLennan, Cora Sutherland, Jesse Camp, Melissa Scanlon, and law students from UW-Madison. And I'd also like to thank the interested group of external stakeholders who provided feedback on our model legislation. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go into some background on AI data centers. We're also going to talk about their electricity and water demands. Then we're going to touch on the Great Lakes as it is relevant to where we're situated. Then we're going to go into some research methods on just obtaining water use data. Focus a little bit on the lack of transparency in government records. Then touch on sustainability reporting. Then briefly go over a case study on Mount Pleasant Racine. And then go over some legislative options that we've identified. So what is a data center? A data center is a facility that contains IT infrastructure, such as servers, routers, and storage systems. They're essential for us to do many of our everyday tasks, like sending emails, surfing the web, storing our photos and videos, streaming music and shows, and supporting AI and crypto. And this list just goes on. So as our technology grows, so does the data center industry. And the United States is the leader in number of data centers worldwide, with about 4,000. And to put that into context, the countries with the second highest number of data centers are the UK or Germany, each with about 500. And in the US, Northern Virginia is the most data center saturated area with over 300 data centers. And in general, there are different sizes of data centers. Many on this map are fairly small and small operations that you would hardly even notice. But as the computing needs have grown, so too has the size of data centers and their needs for land, electricity, and water. AI and crypto are also major contributors to this growth. For instance, in 2024, the total energy used by all 1,230 data centers, the top locations in the US, as you can see here, was 10.7 gigawatts. By comparison, in 2025, OpenAI announced plans for an overarching AI infrastructure platform of 5 Stargate data center sites with 10 gigawatts of capacity. So for our research, we focus on these hyperscale or AI data centers. So data centers also withdraw and consume a lot of water. To put it in personal terms, using AI to draft a 100-word email can use between half to 3 bottles of water, depending on the location. To even get to this point, though, AI must be trained, and a team of researchers estimated that 22 million liters of water were used to train Meta's AI model. So as shown in this pie chart, according to the 2024 report from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to Congress, in 2023, data centers are estimated to have directly consumed approximately 17 billion gallons of water for cooling, and it directly consumed 211 billion gallons to produce electricity to power the centers. And water consumed means it is not returned to be treated and reused in the immediate area where it was withdrawn. That really high water consumption number associated with electricity is because most of the electricity used by data centers comes from fossil fuels or nuclear ways, and these are just ways of producing electricity that are the largest water users in the US. To put it another way, if solar and wind powered AI data centers, they would use So AI data centers are reported to use a large portion of local water supplies. For instance, in the Dalles, Oregon, Google's data centers use over 25% of the city's water. In the Des Moines suburb of Altoona, Iowa, a single data center was using up to 20% of the total water use of the entire suburb in 2024. And when an industry uses such significant portions of an area's water supply, less water is available for agriculture, manufacturing, residential uses, and other purposes. These potential conflicts can be mitigated through planning and by making intentional decisions to commit resources to data centers over other uses. However, when resource demands are obscured from the public view, that level of government planning and choice in development direction is not. And although many of the top technology companies promoting the AI data center expansion have sustainability budgets, their water and non-linear solar electricity consumption is still surging. So the Lawrence Berkeley Lab estimated a nearly 5-fold increase in water needs between 2022 and 2028. Microsoft, for example, expects its annual water needs for about 100 data center complexes globally to grow by 150% from 2020 to 2030. So this is 18 billion liters, or about 4.8 billion gallons of water. Now I want to talk a little about data center cooling technology, as it plays a large role in direct water use. So data centers generate a lot of heat from their daily operations, and there needs to be a cooling system to prevent the equipment from overheating. There are a few different types of cooling systems out there being used for data centers. One is some use air and some use water. For the ones that use water, there are ones through evaporative systems and closed loop systems. And the air cooling, this system works by channeling the hot air generated by the computer equipment, and it goes to the top of the facility where it's circulated to be cooled. And so it essentially just works like a giant air conditioner at these facilities. The water cooling system, as its name suggests, uses water to cool the equipment. And there are two different types of cooling: closed loop and evaporative. In the closed loop system, hot air from the servers rise to enter the heat exchanger, where it is merged with cool water. The water absorbs the heat and is cycled through to be cooled by chillers, leave air cooled. Once the water is cooled down, the water is piped to units which blow out cool air. This cycle repeats using the same water over and over again, and there are usually chemicals added to this, and so this water needs to be refreshed with new water eventually. And because of the tight hold on information as proprietary, we haven't seen any reliable info about these key aspects. Now on the right, the evaporative system works very similarly, but it says when the water is warmed at the top, it produces steam, and this is vented outside of the building. Because the water was turned to steam and was released, new cold water must be refilled and pumped back into the system. And these cooling systems are generally what make data centers so resource intensive, using either a lot of electricity or a lot of water for cooling. And the choice on direct water use also impacts the indirect water use due to the relationship between the cooling technology choice and the electricity required to run it. So data centers must be online at all times, and this requires a constant supply of electricity. In 2022, data centers accounted for about 3% of the US electricity use, a figure that is expected to reach 8% by 2030. And this number doesn't seem like a lot, but when you zoom into the areas hosting these facilities, a different picture is painted. Take Virginia, for instance. Virginia is home to 13% of the world's data center operational capacity and 25% of the Americas. Data centers in Virginia use almost the same amount of energy needed to power 60% of all homes in the state. With the growth of AI, these facilities may need 1 or more gigawatt of power at peak demand. And a year of this level of consumption is twice as much as Pittsburgh's residential consumption in 2023. So this is not sustainable. Currently, renewable energy is too intermittent to meet the constant energy demands of data centers, and contrary to climate and economic goals, fossil fuels are the primary source of power to meet demands for AI data centers. As you can see from this picture, for example, in Omaha, Nebraska, a coal power plant was slated to be decommissioned, but the life of the coal plant has been extended to meet the energy demands of data centers in the area. This coal plant is also near a low-income and largely minority neighborhood that has some of the worst air pollution and highest rates of asthma in that region. And a research team at Cornell University determined that by 2030, the rate of AI growth in the US will put an additional 24 to 44 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and use as much water as 6 to 10 million Americans each year. So where we're situated, the Great Lakes are a specific topic of interest for us at the Center for Water Policy, but these are an important resource for many as they are shared multi-state and multinational resource bordering 8 different US states, 2 Canadian provinces, and many First Nations. And the Great Lakes hold about 85% of North America's fresh surface water. The waters are shared by 40 million people for their drinking water. It cools numerous power plants, is the foundation of Great Lakes communities and industries from paper making to brewing. So the states and provinces crafted a historic Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Compact and Agreement almost 20 years ago, which established regulations for using these waters and a shared monitoring and reporting platform to start to gain a big picture view of the data around water uses. And in 2024, we started to see hyperscale data centers proposed in the Great Lakes region. So we set out to understand the implications of this new industry for the use of our shared waters. Most of what was known when we started researching came from investigative journalists. and we were pursuing a novel area for academic research on that. And in the Great Lakes region, it's a relatively cool climate. This, as well as the relative abundance of water and excess capacity in municipal drinking water systems due to the loss of industry over the last 30 to 40 years, they make the Great Lakes region an attractive location for hot and thirsty data centers. So we used a number of different approaches to assess the potential water demands of data centers. First, we looked to government records to try to analyze water supply and discharge of a data center, hoping to use this information to see a national picture of how much water a data center uses. Next, we turn to private governance for information, ESG, or environmental social governance, or what is also known as sustainability reporting of the major tech companies. And lastly, we conducted 2 case studies to get a better understanding of this topic. One was in Mount Pleasant Racine, Wisconsin, at the initial construction stage. The other was in Fauquier County in Northern Virginia, to see how they have dealt with this issue in the part of the country with the highest concentration of subjects. And so on the next few slides, we'll detail each approach and those findings. One way we tried to assess water demands of a data center was by looking at the supply side of things and how much water initially goes to a data center. And data centers can either be self-supplied through groundwater wells or intake pipes running directly to a water body. Alternatively, data centers receive water from water utilities, and we took a couple different routes to understand what was happening. We looked at NPDES discharge permits through the National ECHO database that EPA maintains. We made public records requests to water utilities in Virginia, and we searched the Great Lakes Regional Database. We found very little in the wastewater records. It seemed data centers did not have permits for direct discharges of wastewater, so perhaps they were discharging instead into municipal wastewater treatment. So we sent record requests to water utilities in Virginia requesting information on how much water was being supplied to data centers through drinking water utilities. We had to first research and identify the data centers. We then had to verify what utility would be supplying each data center. And then we drafted and sent records requests to each utility requesting water usage data. We recorded responses that, per Virginia law, we were not entitled to receive this information because we were not citizens of that state. This highlights just one barrier to accessing public records like this. And ultimately, we obtained data through a collaboration of colleagues in Virginia who are citizens of that state. So this figure shows monthly water use in Loudoun County, Virginia, between 2019 and 2024. And it shows a general trend of increased water use over time along a seasonal pattern. At peak annual water use in August, there is an approximately 101 billion gallon increase between 2019 and 2024. The greatest water use occurs between July and September, with peak monthly usage usually in August each year. And this correlates with the warmest months of the year and shows how outdoor air temperatures impact water needs for cooling. So the Great Lakes states have a compact and agreement that helps us work together to manage and protect the lakes. Under those laws, withdrawals over 100,000 gallons per day must be reported into the Great Lakes Regional Database. Data managers from each state report these withdrawals to the regional body, and this is all public information. So we tried to use this database to assess any withdrawals from the Great Lakes by data centers. And the database has very broad categories such as municipal, industrial, and commercial, but there's no breakdown for individual facilities or even subcategories such as data centers. So we reached out to the data managers of each state to see if they knew of any data centers using water from the Great Lakes, and if so, how much. The majority of the responses were of any data centers that were in the Great Lakes Basin, which was that they were not directly drawing directly from a water source, but instead being supplied by a water utility. And the data managers could only see the aggregate of what the municipal water utility reports. Thus, to get specific data about any given data center, we'd have to contact the utility directly and request that information. A similar process of what we did for the Virginia records request. So you can see how this may be a very long, complex, and difficult process. So just some key takeaways from the public records. Searching government public records for water usage, we found that data centers are customers instead of permit holders. This data was also fragmented, so there's no national or regional database with information on water supply or wastewater for this industry. And ultimately, it would require many records requests of individual water utilities, which we already discussed could be an incomplete solution because these utilities will claim it's confidential or proprietary and not disclose these records to non-state citizens. So another method we used to assess data center resource use was evaluating ESG or sustainability reports. And ESG reporting is a part of private governance, which is driven by NGOs, rather than with public governance, which is based in the government. So because of its private nature, ESG reporting is not necessarily required nor accessible to the public. Nonetheless, many companies voluntarily release these reports. Sustainable operations have become important for major corporations. So ESG reports are a way for companies to showcase their sustainability efforts and progress. And ESG reports look at other aspects of the company aside from its financials. Though many companies disclose details this way, the level of data will differ between companies. So sometimes you're comparing apples to oranges. So we looked at 6 of the top 10 companies with data centers, which were Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Digital Realty, and Equinix from the years 2019 to 2023. And this figure shows the total amount of water consumed per year from 2019 to 2023 by these companies. You'll notice that Amazon is not included in this figure, because Amazon does not release its total amount of water consumption in its sustainability reports. However, Meta and Google were 2 companies with the most detailed reporting, especially with respect to their data centers. So we did a deep dive into their reports. And so the next couple of slides will briefly discuss our findings from their reports. So Meta gives a detailed breakdown of electricity and water use by its data centers. You can see across their worldwide operations that data centers in each year consume 95 to 97%. So this right here. And for water, data centers account for almost all the water consumed by this corporation. The last row here on the bottom shows percent of data center water withdrawals that is consumed, and it is very high, up to 75.7% in the last year of reporting. Google, sorry, let me take a sip of water. Google, unlike Meta, does not provide the electricity consumption breakdown for its data centers, but does provide it for water. And Google very clearly shows withdrawals versus discharge versus consumption by data centers. And again, this data shows a very high percentage of water withdrawn being consumed. Although they do not disclose the cooling technology used in these reports, you might infer from Meta and Google's high water consumption that there's a widespread use of the once-through evaporative cooling systems. So key takeaways from sustainability reports is that water and electricity demands are increasing each year. Data centers are responsible for a vast majority of this resource demand. even with these biggest tech companies. And ESG or sustainability reporting offers more data than public records, but it's still partial and it's hard to compare that across the entire industry. So while we did 2 case studies, today I'm going to discuss Mount Pleasant, and this is a location that involved applying the Great Lakes Compact. The compact prohibits diversion to the Great Lakes Basin with limited exceptions. So the Microsoft data center is being built in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin. Mount Pleasant is a town that receives water from the neighboring city of Racine. Racine is in the Lake Michigan Basin, while Mount Pleasant is not. Before this data center, the site was to be the location of another large facility that requires a lot of water. As part of planning for Foxconn, Wisconsin found Mount Pleasant met an exception standard as a straddling community and could receive 7 million gallons of water from Racine. After the Foxconn project fell apart, Microsoft appeared on the scene to utilize water under the compact exception rule. Knowing this, we inquired into the energy and water demands of the facility. We couldn't find anything in the news, so we first reached out to Mount Pleasant, but they do not have any estimates or information to provide. We then contacted the Racine Water Utility, but received a response that they could not share the information because it was confidential and that we should contact Microsoft. We contacted Microsoft, but their response was not very substantive and still left many questions. We also reviewed Microsoft's ESG or sustainability reports, but Microsoft only shares aggregate global operational data on its water and electricity use, so nothing specific for its data centers. So these reports were not helpful for our purposes. And in 2024 to 2025, the resource demands of this data center could not be determined. More has been released since we concluded this part of our research, but the lack of information during our research period demonstrates significant problems with transparency and the inability of the public to provide meaningful feedback or understand how they may be impacted by hosting such an industry. It also hinders the ability of government officials to fully assess the impacts of the project and whether this is the type of project that will have a positive impact on the community. So given the lack of transparency and potentially very large demands on electricity and water for a hosting community, we next started working on evaluating legislative responses to this emerging industry. We conducted a 50-state review of proposed and enacted legislation affecting the AI data center development. And then based on this review, we developed a legislative model organized around 5 overarching legislative goals. And these goals reflect key issues of public concern and capture the range of legislative responses currently emerging. And rather than mirroring a single framework, the model draws on approaches from multiple states and, where appropriate, incorporates original draft provisions to address gaps we identified and reflect emerging better practices. Importantly, what we are presenting is a menu of legislative options, and these options can be adopted individually or in combination. So while they form a comprehensive legislative package, each option is also designed to function as a standalone response, depending on the state's priorities and context. And while this work is grounded in the rapid growth of AI data centers, many of these legislative responses are intentionally structured so states may choose to apply them more broadly. In other words, to all large water and electricity users, and this is to ensure consistent treatment of high impact resource users across sectors and avoid the creation of AI specific carve-outs where a broader approach is more appropriate. So I'll first highlight each legislative goal, and then on the next slide, I'll outline specific legislative responses states can take to achieve the goal. So the first goal is to improve comprehensive planning so states and regions can better assess the risks and rewards of hosting AI data centers along with their other economic development priorities. The second goal is increasing transparency and public disclosure to support more democratic participation in hosting decisions. The third goal is protecting ratepayers, ensuring that residents and other businesses are not left bearing higher utility costs driven by these large energy-intensive facilities. The fourth goal is establishing energy and water efficiency prerequisites in order to be eligible for permits or tax incentives. And the fifth goal is increasing funding for monitoring and regulating so states can better track current and future water and energy demands and respond as these conditions change over time. So bear with me, because I know this is a lot of text. But after identifying the 5 goals, we articulated legislative responses to meet those goals. And so I'll very briefly describe these options that we're seeing emerge as viable alternatives. And we will also be making this information publicly available so that interested stakeholders and public officials can access the model. Okay, so starting up here with goal 1, states may improve comprehensive planning with several responses. They can enact a moratorium to pause new siting of AI data centers until the state's regulations catch up to the reality of this industry. This could be a standalone provision or be tiered into the next response, which is having states require a statewide cumulative impacts of assessment. Statewide cumulative impacts assessment prior to any permit being approved or a contract being signed. And the third response is to collaborate with neighboring states in a particular region to implement a regional cumulative impacts assessment. And here we offer an example of the Great Lakes Basin. So for goal 2, states may increase disclosure and provide more transparency through several legislative responses. The first one being to prohibit government officials from signing non-disclosure agreements. The second is to require AI data centers to make these upfront disclosures of energy, water, and other natural resources that are being used or projections of those prior to receiving any project approval. The third is to require AI data centers to submit ongoing reports on their resource use and other metrics that are important to the state once those facilities are up and running. For the third goal, states may protect ratepayers from bearing increased utility costs through a couple legislative responses. They can ensure high demand customers pay the full cost of electricity, which can include building more infrastructure to support their demand, and also ensure that high demand customers pay the full cost of water service, which can include wastewater treatment. So for that fourth goal, states may establish energy and water efficiency prerequisites as conditions for permit approval or to be eligible for tax exemptions through a couple of different legislative responses. The first is to establish a renewable energy requirement, and the second is to require recycled wastewater to be used for cooling instead of purified drinking water. And for the last goal, states may more reasonably achieve goals 1 through 4 if they have funding to implement the regulations and enhance the state's natural resources. So a legislative response is to create a funding mechanism that would be paid by AI data centers. So in conclusion, energy and water demands of AI data centers are significant and growing. There is still a lack of accessibility and transparency, and states should make this information more available, or the companies should make this information more available. There is clear information on resource demands, or having clear information on these resource demands is essential. And especially just to inform the public and government decision making. And these 5 legislative policy goals could help mitigate these problems. So with that, I want to thank you all again for hosting me and thank my collaborators at the Center for Water Policy, and I'm happy to take any questions.
In the tradition of this being an actual course, the students get first crack at questions. Yes.
I was just curious, you had said something about changing how the centers are reporting their water usage would be beneficial. Is there a standard going around potentially of like what they should be reporting?
Like what kind of information they should be.
Yeah, what should be included, because like right now in those reports, it's usually just like the gallons per month that you're using. And I'm wondering if there's like a standard being set for what we want to see the data centers produce.
So I think the more information that they can disclose, the better. So not just gallons per day, but I mean, if you're talking about initial disclosure or ongoing reporting.
I mean, more like breaking it down as far as how much is being used for cooling processes and stuff like that. Like,
Right.
how much do we want them to break it down for us?
So it just, I think with the cooling, to answer your question, knowing how much water, especially if it's a closed loop system, for example, how much water needs to initially be filled into that system, with closed loop systems because of them using chemicals that are, we don't know what kind of chemicals, knowing that kind of information. And if it's a center that hasn't been developed yet, knowing what their projections of water use are going to be per day, per month, per year, because depending on the season, as we kind of saw, the hotter it is, more cooling is needed. So seeing just what those projections will look like over time and understanding what that means for, you know, the rest of the resources available for the public or the local community.
Great. Cami, and then it's open season.
In relation to the goal 5, receiving funding to help the other policy recommendations that you made, have you heard from any like stakeholders, policymakers of their own interest in creating that kind of like legislation? Not to say hey, the data centers themselves should pay for it, or is it just center ideation?
Yeah, so for goal 5 in creating a funding mechanism, just based on the research I've seen, it was in only 2 states that mentioned any sort of funding mechanism, and it was mostly just for electricity or the energy sector, not for water use for cooling. So that was kind of where the idea started. And then when we were speaking to the NGOs and interested stakeholders, they had said like, oh, if you're going to do a comprehensive or a cumulative impacts assessment, that costs a lot of money. Where's that going to be funded from? So we essentially came up with goal 5 because there needs to be some sort of funding mechanism to support either like goals 1, 2, 3, or 4. As it's free. And so yeah, that's kind of got that. I'll take the back.
Talk about the tracking by the utility specifically providing the water. It's going to be like utility as a whole and the change in water consumption. Do you find any other like industrial permittees or anyone has like that specific requirement that kind of copy to the data centers? Like, are there other permits that require the tracking specifically of water consumption, water usage?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're just wondering if there's other permits besides water withdrawal permits that would also track.
Or if there's other, like, if there's industrial facilities that are required by the water utility to track their use separately. It's like the water utility track with data center use, separate line as a function. Do they track anyone else separately? Or is everyone just considered like part of the consumption?
So just based on the research that we did, I wasn't here for that, but, the categories were pretty broad, like I said, commercial, industrial, and so it didn't really go into any subcategories, it was all just broad. And it would, again, just be kind of going into a deeper dive and, contacting a specific water utility. Or I guess with data centers, you would need to know which data center facility you want to, get information about, and then go to the water utility. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Yeah, I think so, like, or if it would be a matter of like requiring the data center to report it independently, like a permanent process rather than.
right, so that's just one of our goals. With goal two, we're just trying to make it, as streamlined as possible with having first the states pass a law that would require these data centers or other, large resource intensive industries to report that specific information. So we don't run into the issue that we ran into with trying to request through the water utilities, and the water utilities not always keeping track of every single, facility that was supplied water.
You know, if established data centers, like in Virginia, have the utility rates gone up for the average consumer or not? I mean, it just seems totally unfair that a company that's making a profit, the taxpayers are having a burden.
Yes, there are some research, there has been some research out there, that's been published specifically talking about the rising rate increases for local ratepayers, and, I'm blanking on the name of one of the studies, but, yes, it has been seen, especially in the Virginia area, with just how concentrated the data centers are there. But you're right, it does seem unfair, and that's true. I think why we're seeing in the legislative side, states like Virginia are now trying to play like catch up, and they're realizing now that people are interested in, these facilities coming in, causing their rates to increase, and states are trying to come in now and address that through pieces of legislation to try to mitigate those increased costs.
Is there something about the particular industry, I don't know, the technology that makes this different? Like how does this compare to like a paper plant using water and electricity?
I'm not as familiar with paper plants, but as I explained, data centers, and specifically we're focusing on hyperscale data centers, or data centers that are powering AI. They use a lot of computers, and those computers need to be cooled, and also those computers need to be powered 24/7. So these facilities are constantly running on electricity, which impacts the indirect water use, the water being used to cool power plants, to power those facilities, and then water that needs to be used to cool them. So I think what's unique about these hyperscale data centers, like that we're seeing in Mount Pleasant, Racine, and Fort Washington, is that they have to constantly be running, or else there is a lag in the AI software that consumers like us are using. And so I think that's what's pretty unique about these facilities specifically. Yeah.
Can I address something about pricing? Mind? Okay, so I'm an economist at the school. So electricity rates are highly regulated. And water rates are also highly regulated because water is a natural monopoly, and once it's provided, they have a barrier to entry for other firms. So people usually do not pay the true costs of water at the marginal provision of providing another water plant or something to produce it. And for electricity, for water, we've moved away from flat rate pricing or volumetric pricing in places where there's scarcity. And more utility boards have gone toward increasing block rates where water is scarce. So it means that for the first segment of what a household might use, the rate will be lower than the second tier of what they would use. And they're so you could price summer consumption higher than the base rate to run your basic needs in a household. So often we have charged private and industrial rates differently. And we often, for coal plants, have charged lower marginal rates at night because we can't turn them off. And so that's why we've had like late night shifts in heavy industry where we want to keep using it because we can't store it and we're already running the coal plant. So a lot of these issues of unfairness can be addressed through rate boards. And many of those are run differently. What you saw in ERCOT, Texas, was that there's very little regulation during the 2021 freeze out, and people were allowed to sign up for rates that paid the true cost in true time. So they had to go out by spot rate pricing when everything fell apart. And that additional increment of power was super expensive. So a lot of this can be, this is not my project at all. This is the Water Policy Center's, but a lot of it can be addressed at the state level or through the power pool level and through water boards, through rate pricing.
Yeah.
I have two questions that refer to what might be called the urban heat island concept. Anyone that's lived in Milwaukee for very long knows that all the good western originating storms go to Sheboygan and Racine and they never hit here. And that's because Milwaukee is a gigantic heat balloon that diverts weather. So there's two questions that arise in your talk, not in your talk, but in the concept that you're looking at. And one of them is in Milwaukee and Port Washington, as opposed to La Crosse, there's a huge density of proposed or existing developing AI power centers. And as much as it sounds like it's okay to just cool down those gigawatts of power, the room that they're in may be cool, but the place where that heat is vented is right there. All that heat does not disappear. So the first question, it's not a question, it's just a comment in a way, is anyone even thinking about that and its collaboratory concept, which is weather? Because you discussed a huge difference between the amount of water that was so-called consumed and the amount of water that was returned. And all that water goes into the atmosphere as either water vapor or gas, unless they pump it into the ground, which is even more dangerous. And so downwind of them, rain and snow, lake effect snow, you've heard of it. Now there would be AI effect rain. So is anybody looking into that kind of stuff?
Can't retire yet, Russell.
I haven't, I just changed vendors.
I do know of a professor at UC Riverside, Professor Chalet Red. He talks a little bit more about how we have to think about if these AI data centers are going to exist. That's just where society is heading towards utilizing AI. When it comes to cooling these servers, these computers, taking into account, like what you talked about, the location where these centers are going to be developed, thinking about the climate or thinking about potentially using more hybrid approach to cooling. So hybrid air plus water, or air cooling plus closed loop water cooling, or just using closed loop water cooling. That's why we're suggesting here to improve that comprehensive planning, because those factors do need to be taken into account before any contract is signed, before any permit gets approved, even at the local level. So I've heard talks, about thinking about those different factors that come into play, where facilities being suggested, proposed, but yeah, I mean, that's definitely why we have goal 1, to improve comprehensive planning. So I'll get to you.
Okay, thanks. Can you put a rough estimate on the amount of water that the Microsoft data center will need once it comes up to speed?
I do not have the exact number available. Not sure if you do, Melissa.
And can you put that in relation to how much water the Milwaukee Water Works withdraws every day for County of Milwaukee?
I can't do that, but I that actually just reminded me, I can't say, so the Microsoft data center in Mount Pleasant received, they qualified, for that exception as a shadow community, to get about 7 million gallons per day of water.
If they're scaling up to a 1 gigawatt center, is that gonna be enough for them?
Honestly, I'm not sure, because I'm not familiar with that kind of technology and how it works, but you could think about it as that they need that 1 extra gigabyte or gigawatt of energy, not just about thinking about how requiring more energy will mean potentially more water being used or consumed in those power plants that would have to supply.
Well, there's the cooling of the data center and then the power generation. So I'm just talking about the cooling of the data center.
If they're using a closed loop cooling system, then it shouldn't increase, because the water is just going to keep being recycled, even if they do need to use another gigawatt of energy.
But yeah, clear.
That is definitely something taken into account is the bias. Kind of like what I said, it is comparing apples to oranges, because it's ultimately up to those companies to disclose how much or how little on this information. So that's why it does create this very incomplete picture of even how much water, maybe even like Meta, who had the most detailed amount of reporting, still taking that with a grain of salt. It's something to keep in mind.
So I'm not quite sure about your vote for item B. You said recycle with wastewater for cooling. Does it mean recycle from? Is it equivalent to the closed loop, or is it recycle wastewater from anywhere? And also, people call it reclaimed water. Is this wastewater processed or not?
So it would have to be processed a little bit, probably. So when we're first talking about just recycling, it's more just like taking wastewater, like you said, being treated wastewater, and then utilizing that to cool the servers. And it could be used in a closed loop system. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
So if cooling system's inflow is closed, I think that's the best way to do that. Then you have no water loss. On the other hand, you can use that water, I would say cooling water, hot water as your thermal source. You supply the neighbor, surrounding neighbor. It might just increase the grades for a low this data center can be stopped. Because anyway, there's no way to stop it. It's already planned.
Or they could just use geothermal cooling systems, period. I mean, not as a heat, as an electric system, but I mean, as a more efficient than just circulating water systems. Yeah. We're almost, I don't want to cut off this great conversation, but like 2 more questions.
Yeah, so it'll be fairly short. So the recycling option, I would have expected to see less consumption of water. Is it not commonly used, or do they have to change that water out frequently enough of high consumption?
So are you talking about just recycled wastewater for cooling or just in general?
No, like a closed loop
Yeah.
system, like, if, and I don't know how my data centers are. I don't either, because I'm telling you, but I would have expected to see less water consumption if that was a commonly used system.
Right. And that is something we've noticed, specifically in Fort Washington. I think when those records, these records become available to the public, which is first step you have to take to try to get them to become available to the public. But we're kind of seeing this trend where, or at least in the Fort Washington case, we saw that the company Vantage Data Centers requested a large amount of water, like a couple million gallons per day of water. But then when they had a public presentation to the city of Fort Washington, maybe a few months later, they said they were only using 20,000 gallons per day. So a couple million gallons per day versus 20,000 gallons per day is a little different. It's a huge difference. So again, that literally just goes to the transparency piece, requiring upfront disclosure, because then it is really hard to gauge what amount of water is still available or what resources are left for the local community, and how can a local government really plan out this facility that's coming into their town. So yeah, that is something that we've noticed, and that's why we do really want to focus on increasing that initial disclosure.
Oh, there's one here.
In the closed loops system, were you able to determine or learn what sort of contaminants were being released?
That is also tricky because of the lack of disclosure. There's been some news articles out there where you see people are concerned about the use of PFAS. I've kind of heard that in conversation, but nothing specific. And it's just because it's proprietary.
Okay, the burning question from Sea Grant.
I've been trying to think about how to even like phrase this, but maybe I'm just not understanding like how they all work, but like ChatGPT is probably what most people use for most things, right? And that wasn't included as like one of the major companies. So is it like, is that really hard to find that data, or was that not included, or does each data center use like all the different companies that you have to?
So when I was talking about the Stargate project, OpenAI and Stargate earlier, the Stargate project is something that's supposed to support like AI such as ChatGPT. I think I don't know too much about like the specifics of the companies that are providing. So I can't fully answer your question, but yeah.
I didn't know it was Stargate.
Well, I would like to, I'm really impressed with the great questions and I'm really impressed with attendance today. We have many more seminars to go this semester. I hope that you'll join us for those as well. Thank you so much to Emilie and to the Water Center for being willing to give this talk today and share their fact digging and data finding and expertise. Thank you.